My name is Christopher Merrill, and as the director of the International Writing Program, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Creative Matters, which is sponsored by the Office of Vice President for Research. And so I wish to begin by singling out for special thanks Dan Reed, whose support for the arts and humanities is crucial to the life of our community. Creative Matters, which brings together artists, writers, and thinkers to discuss the creative process, grows out of the Arts Advancement Committee, convened by Provost Barry Butler and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Chadin Jalali, and chaired by Alan McVeigh. Our charge is to synthesize energies, forge connections across disciplines, and spark new ideas in conjunction with the rebuilding of our arts campus. Creative Matters, which is the brainchild of David Geer, George de la Peña, Ann Ricketts, and Leslie Weatherhead, will come back here again next week on Wednesday to hear from DJ Spooky. Creativity is a defining feature of the University of Iowa, the first higher educational institution in this country to award graduate credit for creative work. And Creative Matters is designed to broaden our understanding of the mysterious means by which new discoveries are made in the arts, humanities, and sciences. Central to literature is empathy, a quality in short supply in the current political season, and the subject of Leslie Jamison's best-selling book of essays, The Empathy Exams. Often when I despair over the coarsening of our public life, which happens almost hourly these days, thanks to a certain presidential candidate whose demeaning comments about women, Muslims, immigrants, veterans, and the disabled suggests that he possesses not a shred of empathy, I recall some lines from Ms. Jamison's title essay. Quote, "Empathy isn't just something that happens to us, a meteor shower of synapses firing across the brain. It's also a choice we make to pay attention, to extend ourselves. It's made of exertion, that dowdier cousin of impulse. Sometimes we care for another because we know we should, or because it's asked for, but this doesn't make our caring hollow. The act of choosing simply means we've committed ourselves to a set of behaviors greater than the sum of our individual parts, which of course is what life is all about in every aspect, artistic and affective, political and cultural. And that is why I'm so eager to hear Ms. Jamison address the moral and aesthetic complexities of narrating the lives of others. What kinds of creativity become possible in the act of writing about other people's lives? She will ask, and what kinds of creativity or imagination become ethically problematic when you turn the lives of actual human beings into art? What obligations might a writer feel toward her subjects? The interplay between guilt and affection, between care and skepticism. Suffice to say that the answers she proposes will offer at least a provisional cure for the electoral blues, and perhaps much more. Leslie Jamison, who is a graduate of the Writers' Workshop, is also the author of a well-received novel, The Gin Closet, a columnist for the New York Times Book Review, and a professor at Columbia University. She will give a keynote address tomorrow in The Examined Life, a conference exploring the links between medicine and the arts, which in the nature of any creative enterprise coincides with the Iowa City Book Festival. And so I'm very grateful to our colleagues up the Hill and in the UNESCO City of Literature for helping to make it possible to host her here for Creative Matters. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Jamison back to the University of Iowa.
Hi. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I was saying earlier that Iowa City is a place that just means a tremendous amount to me, so it's wonderful to be back. And I do not know whether my remarks will posit a cure for the electoral blues, which is a tall task, but empathy is both what my book is exploring and part of what I'm going to explore tonight. I think one of the parts of my practice as a writer where empathy feels most active and most lived and also most vexed is in the relationship that develops between me as a writer and my subjects, which always feels like a clinical word, but the people that I write about. And before I start my remarks, I guess I should say also in relation to my Iowa City past is that I came to reporting as I practice it, writing about the lives of others, sort of through the back door because I was always a fiction writer, and when I was here at the workshop, I was in the fiction program. My first book was a novel. And once I started writing nonfiction, I realized that if I wanted to write about lives that weren't mine, and I very much did because I didn't want to just feel that my life's material was the only material at my disposal, I realized that I would need to start learning how to speak and how to engage with others in this strange, murky territory that goes by reporting. And it wasn't necessarily something I came to by temperamental inclination. I still get break out in a sweat before an interview. I feel a lot of anxiety about it. But I like to think about that anxiety as kind of part of the question and the problem and the adrenaline and the experience of doing it. At the beginning of The Journalist and the Murderer, her classic meditation on the interpersonal dynamics of reportage, Janet Malcolm offers what might be called an aphoristic provocation. It's become infamous. Every journalist who is not too stupid or full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. He is a kind of confidence man, preying on people's vanity, ignorance, or loneliness, gaining their trust and betraying them without remorse. The first time I read this, I felt simultaneously consoled by it and preemptively haunted by it. I felt consoled by it because I had already begun to feel the ways in which writing about other people was sometimes going to hurt them or make them feel betrayed, and it felt good to know I wasn't alone in that betrayal. But I also felt haunted by it because I didn't want to spend my life making people feel abused and betrayed. I knew that I couldn't write with integrity if I wrote to please everyone I wrote about. But I also knew that I wanted to find a way to write about people that felt guided by a spirit of appreciation and empathy. Over the years, I've written about people suffering from a disease that no one else believes in. I've written about a blue whale dubbed the loneliest whale in the world, a whale no one has ever seen, a whale with a song unlike anything ever heard, and the people who have become obsessed with him. I've written about parents who believe their kids have past life memories. I'm currently writing a book that's about, among other things, a group of elderly alcoholics who went to the same Maryland rehab program back in the early 1970s, right when Nixon launched his war on drugs. I've tried to find a way to write about the lives of others that manages something other than betrayal. As I've struggled with this in my own work, I've been drawn to writers and reporters who understood themselves as somehow deeply obligated to the subjects they wrote about. In 1887, an aspiring reporter named Nellie Bly arrived at a women's boarding house on 2nd Avenue, pretended to be insane. She'd practiced her crazy eyes in front of her own bathroom mirror, and got herself sent to an asylum on Blackwell's Island in the middle of the East River. She wrote sensational newspaper reports that peddled spectacle as well as lamenting injustice. She described women on the rope, harnessed to a long chain, spiders baked into stale bread, the reeking gin breath of an attendant, the cruelty of nurses teasing a blind woman or beating a woman for crying too much, slapping her face, knocking her head, dragging her into a closet. Bly wrote, "I plainly saw the marks of their fingers on her throat for the entire day."
Her text made the marks visible for more than a century, left their residue in newsprint. She described a woman separated from her 5 children, begging to hold the infant child of a visitor. When the visitor wanted to leave, the woman's grief was uncontrollable as she begged to keep the babe which she imagined was her own. At night, Bly looked through the bars of her room at the, quote, lights of Manhattan faintly glimmering, which seemed so near, and yet heaven is not further from hell. She wrote, "All night long, I listened to a woman cry about the cold and beg for God to let her die." Her writing insisted to her readers, while you are here, they are there. Her writing said, while you are reading this sentence, they are on the rope, or eating spiders, or begging strangers to leave their babies, or begging God to let them die. In the summer of 1936, a young journalist named James Agee spent several months with 3 sharecropper families in Alabama. Everything there was unpredictable from day to day, he wrote in a letter to a friend. I was half crazy with the heat and diet. The trip was very hard and certainly one of the best things I've ever had happen to me. But, he said, writing what we found is a different matter. What had he found? He'd found the unceasing depletions of hard work in cotton fields. He found well water that tasted, quote, sad on the mouth. He found spoiled pork and barefoot children. He found a mother ravaged by 8 years of pellagra, her skin red and blistered from lesions. He found flies, quote, vibrating to death in dirty glasses of buttermilk, families living in 2-room shacks with the ghosts of their dead children. He wanted to offer an account of all that, wanted to bear witness to it, but he wasn't fluent in any language that could hold it. He wanted to make visible the spectacular brutality of their labor. He wanted to fight what he called the intuitive structures of a system that normalized this labor, that made it okay for some people to live like this while others profited, the system that dissolved the brutality of this arrangement into simple pragmatism. He wanted his writing to do all this, but he felt suspicious of every kind of writing he knew. He wanted to, quote, tell everything possible as accurately as possible with as total a suspicion of creative and artistic as of repertorial attitudes and methods. He wrote that everything he wrote would come up short. I feel sure in advance that any efforts in what follows along the lines I have been speaking of will be failures. His book began by saying he wished it wasn't a book at all. If I could do it, I'd do no writing at all here. It would be photographs. The rest would be fragments of cloth, bits of cotton, lumps of earth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors, plates of food and of excrement. A piece of the body torn out by the roots might be more to the point. He wanted to know how art could ever respond to suffering. It's not just a question for artists, but a question for everyone, anyone who lives alongside the pain of others, which is to say, all of us, everywhere. How do we live alongside injustice? In 2000, a poet named C.D. Wright traveled with a photographer to 3 prisons in Louisiana. I will be wakeful, she told herself before those trips. It is a summons. In her wakefulness, she met a man named Grasshopper, standing beside a coffin he'd built in the woodshop. He told her he'd come in when his wife was pregnant, Now his son was in prison. She met a man who'd, quote, hung strips of a plastic bag from his bunk and pretended he was in his boat and his cellmates flushing the Arctic Ocean. She met a woman who said, I missed the moon. She heard about the last requests of a man before his execution. He, quote, preferred to eat with the warden. He, quote, asked that his mother not be present. He, quote, asked that his eyes be given to another. She called her account of these trips One Big Self because she was interested in her encounters as acts of reunification, bringing the artist back into society, bringing inmates back into public view. She wrote, the popular perception is that art is a part. I insist it is a part of. Something not in dispute is that people in prison are apart from. If you can accept, whatever level of discipline and punishment you adhere to momentarily aside, that the ultimate goal should be to reunite the separated from the larger human enterprise, it might behoove us to see prisoners, among others, as they elect to be seen, in their larger selves. Later, she wrote, nothing will be settled or made easy. One grasshopper, a lost moon, and an Arctic Ocean later, she wrote, there is no point, and we will not shrink from it. What must we not shrink from? I've struggled constantly with the prospect of betraying my own subjects. At the end of one piece, I even confessed that fear directly. It was a piece I wrote about a mysterious condition called Morgellons disease, a controversial illness whose self-declared sufferers report a variety of skin symptoms, including, most remarkably, unexplainable material emerging from their skin, fibers and fuzz and threads. I traveled to their annual conference in Austin, Texas, not so much to determine whether Morgellons was real or not, but to document the community that had formed around it. I went there wanting to be compassionate, and I did find myself experiencing compassion toward people who were suffering, but I also felt increasingly that I didn't agree with their own understanding of their suffering's source. I closed the piece like this. I want to sit down in front of everyone I've heard, listen to their voices in my tape recorder like a child could listen, like an agnostic, like a pluralist. I want to be the compassionate nurse, not the skeptical doctor. I want the abyss, not the verdict. I want to believe everyone. I want everyone to be right. But compassion isn't the same thing as belief. This isn't a lesson I want to learn. It wasn't until the 17th century that the words pity and piety were fully distinguished. Sympathy was understood as a kind of duty, an obligation to some basic human bond. And what I feel toward this disorder is a kind of piety. I feel an obligation to pay homage, or at least accord some reverence to these patients' collective understanding of what makes them hurt. Maybe it's a kind of sympathetic infection in its own right, this need to go along with, to nod along with, to support, to agree. Paul said, I wouldn't tell anyone my crazy-ass symptoms. Paul was a patient. When I say it like that, it sounds like I mean the gospel. Paul said, I wouldn't tell anyone my crazy-ass symptoms, but he told them to me. He's always been met with disbelief. He called it typical. Now I'm haunted by that word. For Paul, life has become a pattern, and the moral of that pattern is you're destined for this. The disbelief of others is inevitable, and so is loneliness. Both are just as much a part of this disease as any fiber, supposed or actual, any speck or crystal or flock of bugs. I went to Austin because I wanted to be a different kind of listener than the kind these patients had known. Doctors winking at their residents, friends biting their lips, skeptics smiling smug. But wanting to be different doesn't make you so. Paul told me his crazy-ass symptoms, and I didn't believe him, or at least I didn't believe him in the way he wanted to be believed. I didn't believe there were parasites laying thousands of eggs under his skin, but I did believe he hurt like there were, which was typical. I was typical. In writing this essay, how am I doing something that he wouldn't understand as betrayal? I want to say, I heard you, to say, I pass no verdicts, to say, I think you can heal, or maybe simply, I hope you do. What do I owe my subjects? And here's the flip side of that question. What constitutes betrayal? Sometimes duty becomes more visible in its disappointment. I see in my guilt what I hadn't fully realized I owed. I don't owe my subjects everything. I don't owe them the story they would have told about themselves. I don't owe them perfection on the page. But I owe them clarity around the terms of our relationship and the terms of my telling. I owe them, most importantly, the dignity of complexity on the page. I owe them the chance to contradict themselves, the chance to be more than evidence supporting a thesis statement I've devised for them to serve. When I wrote about people who self-identified as having a disease no one else believed in, I didn't owe it to them to agree with how they diagnosed themselves, but I did owe it to them not to turn their condition into a simple metaphor for a certain species of bodily unease or an abiding discomfort in one's own skin. I began to feel that turning them into metaphor was the worst kind of exploitation, using them to support some argument I was making about how we attach our discomfort to external correlatives. This felt like forcing their pain to serve my own authorial agendas. What does the dignity of complexity look like? It often takes the form of context. When I wrote in another piece about a man who spoke obsessively about his wealth and his professional success, I didn't owe it to him to silence these obsessions, to make him look better than he was, somehow not obsessed with his own status. But it did feel important to contextualize his obsession with money inside an account of his childhood. His mother cleaning the homes of steel baron millionaires in an industrial town in Pennsylvania. His own teenage days working in a steel factory. Money meant something to him for a reason. I wanted to offer glimpses of that reason, the root systems of his attachment to the material. In this way, in granting my subjects the dignity of complexity, ethics and aesthetics align. Complication honors the many parts of a subject and constructs a figure on the page more alive, more faithful to lived experience in all its vexation and nuance. For a year, several years ago, I was working on a piece about the whale I mentioned earlier, the whale called 52 Blue, a blue whale named for its singular song, a song sung at a higher pitch than any other blue whale ever heard. This whale had never been seen, but he had been tracked by underwater Navy hydrophones, and he had always been tracked traveling alone, never with a mate or a pod. For this reason, he'd been dubbed the loneliest whale in the world, a whale crying out with a song not like any others, a whale unable to find his tribe. In short, he'd become the canvas upon which a bunch of anthropomorphic projections had been flung. My piece was partially about the whale, but it was mainly about the many and various people who'd become obsessed with this whale, who had attached to him as a kind of mascot or comrade. My writing has always been interested in loneliness and the surprising escape hatches we find out of loneliness, and this whale was one of the most surprising escape hatches I'd ever heard of. I loved the unexpected communion made possible by this singular creature and his singular song. I talked to people all over the world who had become attached to him or their various ideas of him. A tabloid photographer in Poland who got the whale tattooed across his back, a union leader in Ireland, a Muslim American woman in Michigan. But the woman I got to know best was a woman living in Harlem. She had an intense, very mystical way of talking about her connection to 52 Blue. Her comments moved me deeply, but I felt nervous about reproducing them. Would I make her sound crazy or foolish? I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to condescend to her by feeling I needed to modify or paraphrase her beliefs. Eventually, it felt like context was the answer, giving a full account of the period of crisis and bodily suffering that had given rise to her attachment to the whale. I began not with her obsession, but with the things that had delivered her to this obsession. July 2007, Harlem, New York. Leonora knew she was going to die, not just someday, but soon. She'd been suffering from fibroids and bleeding for years, sometimes so heavily that she was afraid to leave her apartment, heavily enough that she grew obsessed with blood, thinking about blood, dreaming about blood, writing poems about blood. She'd grown increasingly reclusive. She'd stopped working as a case supervisor for the city, a job she'd held for more than a decade. Leonora was 48 years old. She had always been a self-sufficient person. She'd been working since she was 14. She'd never been married, though she'd had offers. She liked to know she could support herself. But this was a new level of isolation. One family member had told her, "You are in a very dark place," and said she no longer wanted to see her. By summer, things had gotten worse. Leonora felt truly ill, relentless nausea, severe constipation, aches across her whole body. Her wrists were swollen, her stomach bloated, her vision blurred with jagged spirals of color. She could hardly breathe when she was lying down, so she barely slept. When she did sleep, her dreams were strange. One night, she dreamed about a horse-drawn hearse moving across the cobblestone streets of another century's Harlem. She picked up the horse's reins, looked it straight in the eye, and knew it had come for her. She unlocked her apartment door so that her neighbors wouldn't have trouble removing her body before it, quote, stank up the place. She called her doctor to tell her as much. "I'm pretty sure I'm going to die." And her doctor got pissed, said she needed to call the paramedics, said she was going to live. So Leonora called the paramedics. When they were wheeling her off on a gurney, she asked them to turn around and take her back so she could lock the door again. This was how she knew she'd regained faith in her own life. If she wasn't going to die, she didn't want to leave her door unlocked. That request, asking the paramedics to turn around, is the last thing Leonora can remember before 2 months of darkness. That night in July was the beginning of an odyssey, 5 days of surgery, 7 weeks in a coma, 6 months in the hospital, that would eventually deliver her, in her own time and her own way, to the story of 52 Blue. Leonora woke up in St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in September of 2007. What had happened in the previous 2 months, after the paramedics wheeled her out of her apartment, was only explained to her long after it was over, once she'd recovered enough to process it. The doctors had discovered that a severe intestinal blockage was making her ill, and she'd had major surgery over the course of 5 days. The surgeons removed everything the blockage had rotted. The more they looked, the more necrotic tissue they found. They kept cutting out portions of her intestines, 7 inches, 9 inches, 3 inches, until they'd gotten it all. By the time they were finished, nearly 3 feet were gone. The remaining incision was huge. Leonora was put into a 7-week coma so she could recover more efficiently, and after she awoke, she remained hospitalized for several months to keep the open wound from becoming infected. She was on an IV. She hardly knew how to speak. She thought it was another year entirely. Her father came to visit once, and she vomited when she saw him. She could barely make herself understood, could barely convey how much she wanted him to leave. At one point, she sensed an incredible stench all around her. She didn't know where it was coming from. She said, "Smell," and someone understood. Eventually, they realized it was her hair, which was matted with blood. She asked one of her doctors to cut it. The doctor said that wasn't her job. Leonora said, "If you don't do that, I will start screaming now, and I will not stop." The doctor did it. It turned out looking pretty good. Weeks later, they joked that the doctor might have a second career as a hairdresser. For Leonora, the hardest part of recovery was losing her self-sufficiency, feeling that I could no longer be independent, she said, that I could no longer take care of myself. Ever since I was 14, I've been doing that. In the aftermath of her coma, Leonora couldn't walk. She had trouble remembering words. She couldn't count past 10. She couldn't even quite count to 10, but she pretended. She didn't let on. She didn't want other people to see her struggling. The hospital offered decent physical rehab, but nothing to help her re-inhabit her own mind. Leonora was wheeled into the hospital on July 6, 2007, and wasn't home again until 2008. She went to a rehabilitation facility in November, then had a bad fall. She still wasn't walking well, and returned to the hospital and then to another rehab in December. During these months at various institutions, she had visitors, but generally she felt abandoned, like everyone in her life was fleeing her damage, pushing her away for a simple, primal reason: the healthy don't like to be around the sick. Her illness made them uncomfortable, she thought, because it reminded them of their own mortality, or the fact of mortality itself. During much of her recovery, Leonora couldn't even watch television. It gave her headaches. So she turned to the internet. It was a way to find interest and beauty in the world, and it was then, alone and late at night, once again, searching for something that might offer a sense of meaning, that she came upon the story of 52 Blue. By then, the story of the whale had been floating around the internet for several years, but it spoke to Leonora with a particular urgency. It resonated. He was speaking a language that no one else could speak, she told me. And here I was, without a language. I had no more language to describe what had happened to me. So I was like him. I had nothing. No one to communicate with. No one was hearing. No one was hearing him. And I thought, I hear you. I wish you could hear me. She identified with his plight. She felt that her own language was adrift. She was struggling to come back to any sense of self, much less find the words for what this self was thinking or feeling. It was hard to speak, because her trachea was so scarred from all the tubes that had been thrust down it during her coma. She felt the world pulling away. When she found the whale, she found an echo of this difficulty. She remembers thinking, I wish I could speak whale. She found a strange kind of hope, a sense of certainty that he must know he wasn't alone. I was like, here he is. He's talking, he's saying something, he's singing, and nobody's really understanding, but there are people listening. I bet he knows people are listening. He must feel it. Eventually, I didn't just write about Leonora, but also about my relationship with Leonora, about the relationship that had formed between us. I wrote about the red robin we saw one day near the end of winter, and how she told me that robin was my robin. that it would signal a huge change in my life, and how 3 days later I met the man who would become my husband. My editor cut that detail, but I'm mentioning it here because it mattered to me. It mattered to implicate myself in the way Leonora understood herself as connected to the world, its signals and its omens. And it mattered to me to offer some account of the ways that Leonora and I had become connected to each other. I wrote about my interactions with Leonora not because I felt like I needed to be part of the story or to block her body figuratively with my own, but because I wanted to offer my experience of being moved by her relationship to the whale. I felt that I would allow more nuance into my portrait of Leonora by exploring the ways I was reckoning with her voice and with her attachment to this creature. I wasn't sure what to make of her, and there was something that felt productive in that uncertainty. In The Silent Woman, Janet Malcolm's absolutely brilliant account of the fraught legacy of Sylvia Plath, the ways she has become a canvas in her own right, the object of so much projection, an elusive whale upon which various narratives have been flung, Malcolm offers a description of the kind of authority readers seek from their authors. Every now and then, a biography comes along that strangely displeases the public. Something causes the reader to back away from the writer and refuse to accompany him down the corridor. What the reader has usually heard in the text, what has alerted him to danger, is the sound of doubt, the sound of a crack opening in the wall of the biographer's self-assurance. As a burglar should not pause to discuss with his accomplice the rights and wrongs of burglary while he is jimmying a lock, so a biographer ought not to introduce doubts about the legitimacy of the biographical enterprise. But I'm interested, and I think Malcolm is as well, by the ways that discussing the burglary while it's still going on can actually humanize a piece, can illuminate the human reporter at its center, a living, breathing person relating the living, breathing people she's interviewing. The first piece I ever reported, though I hesitate to even use that word, reported, because I had no idea what I was doing, was in the mountains of Tennessee. I decided to follow my older brother to this crazy race he was running through a place called Frozen Head State Park. It was called the Barkley Marathons. Marathons, plural, because the race was 125 miles long. I wrote that piece with a mixture of bewilderment and appreciation, and it was important to me to allow for that electric charge of contradiction, the ways I was impressed and confused at once by what it meant for these people to willingly subject themselves to that kind of extremity and pain. A few years after I went to the Barkley Marathons, I found myself driving to a prison in the middle of West Virginia. I was going to visit Charlie Engle, one of the runners I'd met at the Barkley Marathons, who was serving 2 years on counts of mortgage fraud. I'd been corresponding with him for a year because I wanted to write about his experience of incarceration. I explained our relationship in the beginning of the piece I wrote. I first wrote Charlie a letter because I was fascinated by his life. It gave me a sense of vertigo to know that when we'd met in the hills of Tennessee, he'd had no idea what was about to happen, how everything was going to change. I wondered what incarceration was like for him. Running, he wrote, made me feel free and smooth and happy. His body was a body that found solace in moving itself across territory, across deserts and jungles and entire nations. The core of his life pointed its finger at the very fact of what incarceration does, which is to keep someone in one place. I wanted to know what happens when you confine a man whose whole life is motion. One thing that happens is you turn him into a good pen pal. Over the course of our correspondence, Charlie was smart and funny and honest. He steered himself away from anger about his incarceration, but he did so with such intentionality, such earnest and visible effort, that the anger itself emerged as a negative shape carved in the margins of his letters. Charlie described it as a cliff. He had to pull himself back from the brink. My anger is immense, and I hate the feeling that I am losing control, which happens mostly when I let that anger breathe. He looked for what he could salvage. Like all difficult things, if we can remain open, something positive will come. That said, he wrote, I am still a bit baffled about what good will come from this for me. I lost a lot. He wrote about his mother, who was slipping into dementia. I miss her. I can say that it's unfair for me to be away from her, and it would be true. He wrote about women. I have never gone this long in my adult life without sex. I don't think I could have ever gone a year alone out there. Out there, incidentally, was a phrase I heard frequently at the Barkley Marathons, the ultra run where I first met him. At Barkley, out there meant in the wilderness, on the course, getting lost or getting found or whacking your way through underbrush. Out there meant you were in motion, doing the thing, winning or getting beaten. In here, in prison, was the opposite of all that. It was never getting lost, never going where you hadn't already been. The morning I went to visit Charlie in prison, I woke up nervous. I wrote, I don't feel like I've gotten much sleep, but I can remember what I dreamed. I was interviewing a man in a dingy diner, and I had just gotten through my chit-chat questions and was preparing to get into it, though I wasn't sure what it was. When the man rose to pay the bill, I woke with a feeling of panic. I hadn't asked any of the questions that mattered. It's a dream so obvious I feel betrayed by it. It neither dissolves an extant fear nor illuminates a new one. It simply tells me I'm afraid I'll say stupid things, as I'm always afraid of saying stupid things, that I will ask questions that are beside the point, that my curiosity will prove little more than useless voyeurism, a girl lifting her sunglasses to peer between the bars, stuttering, "What's it like here? What part hurts the most?" In prison, Charlie and I talked for 6 hours straight. We got vending machine pastries and sodas with rolls of quarters that I'd brought. After our visit, I felt close to Charlie, but I also felt the fallacy embedded in that feeling of closeness. I'd left prison. He remained. I felt concern for him and sadness for him, and sadness at the fact of incarceration itself, its vast, inhuman, unjust scale, this tiny sliver of it that I'd seen. And I felt glad for the hours I'd spent with Charlie, but also acutely aware of how limited they'd been, how built into the whole journalistic project was a set of limits about how much you could ever know about another person. I was aware of leaving him behind in there as its own form of betrayal. I decided to write about that betrayal rather than simply leaving it unarticulated in the margins. At 3 p.m., the end of visiting hours, some of us exercise our right to disappear, and others are reminded that they no longer can. One man exercises his right to run 540 times around a gravel track. That was something Charlie had done. What happens when you confine a man whose whole life is motion? I guess those laps. Maybe tonight I'll meet that stranger again. Maybe he'll come back to the greasy diner. Maybe I'll buy him a Coke or a cookie the size of his face, and he can stand for every man who's ever had a story, and I can stand for everyone who hasn't listened hard enough. I'll ask that stranger every single question any person ever asked another person. I'll ask him enough questions to dissolve rhetoric and cinder block partitions. I'll ask him enough questions to make him visible again. So many questions will have to stay in the dream of that diner forever. Looking back, I realized that the difficulties embedded in my relationship with Charlie are not difficulties I left behind when I left prison or when I finished the final rounds of edits on that piece. With Charlie, I'd become aware of a certain fantasy of proximity, the longing for closeness, for writing as connective transparency, and that I would probably carry this fantasy into every journalistic encounter I ever had. It didn't make me a saint, and it didn't make me an idiot. It didn't even necessarily make me unprofessional. It was simply something I'd have to reckon with. I'd have to reckon with an inevitable and ultimately productive distance, just as I'd have to reckon each time with the necessary limits of my own understanding, with everything that would remain mysterious. Thanks. So yeah, we'd love to open it up to questions if people have them. I was telling Chris questions are really my favorite part because I know as much as one can know one's own thoughts, I know my own thoughts, but I don't know yours, so. Yeah.
First, I really appreciate you marking the difference between the skills needed to write literature and the skills needed to interact with the question mark.
Yeah.
Those often get confused. They're as important. So thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate what you're saying about not wanting to use people to illustrate ideas we already have, and all the limits of telling someone's whole story, the limits of pleasing one's subjects, the limits of maybe pleasing the expectations of the reader. But I'm wondering, do you have a sense when you're writing of what you're measuring the success or not of the work against? Kind of throw all those.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to try to briefly recapitulate the question, and I apologize if I paraphrase it wrong. But the question is about sort of all of the limits that I'm recognizing, the limits of how much we could know another person, the limits of how much we could please the subjects that we're writing about, the limits of kind of capturing totality. And so if we recognize all those limits, then what remains as like the metric as you're writing to figure out whether what you're doing or if you're doing anything? No, it's a great question. I mean, I guess for me, often the metric that I use, or the first kind of intuitive metric that I use, is whether something feels overly simple or easy in the text. And that's usually a gut level reaction that I have when I'm reading a first draft. And almost always in a first draft of a piece, whether I'm writing about my own life, whether I'm writing a critical response, whether I'm writing a reported piece, I can feel the ways. It's like hearing a hollow floorboard or something. I can hear the times when I'm saying something kind of glib or flip or making it too simple or easy. Often that takes the form of some idea or thesis statement that I had going into the piece, and I'm slotting the pieces in, but I can feel the friction of where I'm trying to jam a human body or a human life or my own life into a thesis statement that doesn't quite fit. And so often, honestly, that registers on the level of language too. I can feel my prose either take refuge in a cliche, or else it's hedging somehow, equivocating in a way that doesn't feel rigorous but sort of cowardly. So all of those are sort of tips that I'm not telling the story underneath the story. I'm sort of telling the cocktail party version or the easier groove of it. So some of it is just listening for a kind of tonal, like a tonal scaredy cat moment. And then I think, but the point of listening for those moments is to deliver the piece into a kind of complexity that even if it doesn't capture everything about my subject, or even if it doesn't capture everything about my life or some era in my life, that it at least conjures up some sort of tension or complexity that felt core to me as I was listening to somebody tell their story, or as I was sort of going back into the realms of my own memory. So I guess it's really that sense of achieving a kind of complexity, even if not resolution, that feels like the metric of success, or one of them. Yeah, in the red. Oh. Yeah. One answer to that question, well, both might not come as a surprise from the piece, but certainly Janet Malcolm is a figure who has been really inspiring for me and has granted a certain kind of permission that also feels like a call to action in a way. So Janet Malcolm, part of what I like about her work is that it blends a critical mode and a reporting mode. So for example, The Silent Woman, the book that I mentioned briefly about Sylvia Plath, is like a classic example of reading biographies of Sylvia Plath and critically and analytically seeing, okay, what were the agendas of these biographies? How were they sort of approaching Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes' doomed marriage in different ways? But then there was a whole other part of the project that involved reporting, going and speaking to the people who had read biographies, going and speaking to Olwen Hughes, Ted Hughes' very protective sister. And so she was using those pieces of the project very much to inform each other. And I really, that made a lot of sense to me, that you wouldn't just, if you were pursuing a certain history or a certain set of questions, the pursuit might not just require you to be in one role, reporter, critic, but it might actually ask you to inhabit a few different roles. So I like that. But I think sort of affectively, part of what I really dig about Janet Malcolm is that as opposed to feeling like a moment in an interview where she's talking to a subject where there's kind of friction in the interview, or the subject is getting defensive, or seems to be offended or bothered, or trying to kind of deflect away from a question that Malcolm has asked, as opposed to reading that as a moment where the interview has kind of gone off course or failed or is obstructing the project. Malcolm sees those moments of friction as the moments of possibility and the moments where the sort of floor is dropped out of the interview to show like a cellar underneath. And that to me is, well, on an emotional level, it felt good because I'm like a pathological people pleaser, and so I'm prone temperamentally in an interview, if a subject is like resisting me or seems to be bothered or seems to be acting like a question isn't the right question, I can totally internalize that reaction as the truth that I'm asking the wrong question or the interview is going down the wrong path. So the idea that like hitting a hiccup in the rhythm of an interview would actually mean like stuff was just getting started, or you were like finally hitting some heat spot, I love that. It's not always true. Sometimes it can really mean something is going off the rails or not headed in the right direction. But this idea that friction was generative interpersonally not only like really aligned with what already felt true to me about intellectual inquiry, that like when you hit some friction or hit some tension, you were like just getting into the heart of things, that could also be true interpersonally, felt intuitive, but I hadn't quite translated it yet. And then she opened that up for me. And the other person that comes to mind also showed up in the talk, and that's James Agee, who worked in he worked in a reporting mode that started out in a somewhat standard fashion, and then in his huge book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, like really upended the conventions of what reporting was. And so many people loathe that book because it's not just about these sharecropper families in Alabama in the 30s, it's about Agee's process of writing about them. So it's about Agee's guilt, it's about Agee's uncertainty, it's about how Agee felt in a bed with a bunch of fleas, like he's really in the frame. And in a way it becomes maddening. It's maddening to me as well. The book is 415 pages long. But there's also a way in which it feels deeply important, something feels ethically important to me about that, about confessing the fact that his privilege did make a difference in that room, the fact that he was a Harvard-educated guy showing up in these two-room shacks, like that made a difference. And to act as if that power dynamic wasn't there, to disappear it, to put it in the margins, would have been leaving out some huge like ribbon of energy running through those interactions. So I like that he brought it in, and I like that he was always confessing his own failure. It gets tiring. It gets tiring like the 200th time that he confesses how his book is failing. But there's also something that feels like noble about, to me, just like overdoing it with that sort of acknowledgement, that humility. Or what I read as, there's something that becomes sort of
about a certain excessive performance of humility, but there's something in the spirit of that just changed the way I thought about what it meant to write about other people's lives. So, yeah, in the back.
When you illuminate, you create a shadow, maybe the distortions you might feel, but regret. That's just thinking what's the most important thing.
Yeah. There was a kind of a comment and a question, and the comment was about thinking about this difference between maybe guilt and regret. And I love that formulation that illuminating casts a shadow, and that part of the emotional experience of the illuminator is to be also aware of that shadow. And the question was, what's the most important thing in an interview? I guess I'll say one big thing and one little thing. I'm obviously not a very concise question to answer, but the big thing I'll say is that I always go into an interview with like a bunch of questions lined up that feel compelling to me based on everything I already know. But I feel like the particular choreography of every interview and the way that it feels necessary and productive to really be trying to respond to the particular cues of the subject inside the conversation. So, for example, to try to discriminate between a kind of, this gets back to Malcolm, but a kind of resistance where you feel like you actually might be getting into some pretty interesting territory, and a kind of resistance where you need to like step back and maybe not just keep pushing. To ask questions that respond to what has been said rather than just kind of carrying on whatever pre-imagined agenda I had for what the interview would cover also falls into that terrain of like responding to cues. So I guess it's like thinking about every interview as its own particular dance, and within that dance trying to be really responsive to the motions of the other. And then the little thing I would say is that actually the editor, also named Charlie, who I worked with on the whale piece, told me this, and I just thought it was really good advice, that it's whenever you can to be doing something with the person you're interviewing rather than just sitting across a table from them, can really take an interview to places it couldn't have gone otherwise, and I have found that to be true. So like driving around the naval base with the old Navy guy who used to operate the hydrophones that had tracked the whale, or for this book project I'm working on now, basically spending 3 days driving around Portland with a woman, the thing driving out to Mount Hood with her, like the things that came up when we drove were things that they mattered so much, but somehow like we couldn't have gotten there if we were just at a table, because she was seeing the hospital where she'd had her second round of chemo, and she was seeing the hotel where she had wanted to go with her first boyfriend but had ended up going with her 2 kids after a divorce. And like those things, it was like things were coming up for her because we were in motion. So that idea of being in motion, I really hold on to as well. Yeah.
Have you ever gone back and interviewed the subject after something has come up?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is whether I've ever gone back and interviewed a subject after a piece about them has come out. I haven't gone back and done an interview with subjects, but I have had exchanges with subjects about their reactions to pieces, which have gone all kinds of different ways. Everything from, Leonora, for example, was somebody where I had a lot invested in. Even though I know you can't write a piece to please everyone, I really had a lot. She felt like a vulnerable subject in all kinds of ways, and I wanted the piece to feel good to her. And there were certain things that she told me she didn't want in it, and I respected that. Different writers work different ways, but and she was somebody where, she. I think she loved the piece. She had a good response to it, and she actually gave me a little painting of the robin that I mentioned in the piece that's like on our fridge at home. So there are some of those, but it's not always so kind of
happy ending at the end of the fairy tale. Like there was a child psychologist who was a kind of key figure in the piece I mentioned really briefly about kids who have past life memories, and he was. I don't think he really liked the piece I wrote. I think he wanted a piece that was going to bring his work out into the world in a way that more unequivocally supported it. So I think there were parts of my skepticism he didn't appreciate, but he also said that he felt like it was a fair piece, and that meant something to me. To be honest, probably the people who have had the worst responses are the people that I haven't seen since. So there is ongoing contact, but I mean I've never kind of gone back into the full work of writing again about somebody after the first time. So yeah. Yeah, another great question. The question is about sort of the relationship between rigor and tension and frustration, or when the sort of pursuit of, or when a sort of tension that feels productive sort of veers into frustration instead. I mean, all the time. And what's a good, I feel like every piece sort of journeys through the land of frustration before it comes out to another side, if it ever does. Maybe a good example is the piece I'm working on right now. Sometimes I hear my own voice talking about how many drafts an essay went through in the past and how it was so beautiful that it had to go through 9 drafts and all this stuff. But then I think about what I'm working on right now, and of course I want it to be done after the first draft or the second draft. I don't want it to go through beautiful 9 drafts. And the book that I'm working on right now is this book about addiction and recovery, and it's not a collection of essays. It's trying to accomplish this kind of weave of personal narrative and critical archival work about authors who got sober, and this reported work about people who went through a particular rehab center, and trying to kind of weave those strands together, but on a scale of like 500 pages, not 20. So some of the major frustrations for me have been structural, or trying to figure out what is the right unit size of container to build this book from. And part of, it's not a resolved frustration yet, but it is in motion. And part of it has been about recognizing that maybe a piece or a work needs different structures at different parts of the composition process. So for this piece, I needed to write everything down in like huge blocks of narrative, like my own story, the stories of different authors, the stories of different people who went through the rehab center. That was how the composition needed to happen. But then the unit during revision is a smaller unit, so I can sort of break up those narratives into smaller pieces and weave them together a little bit more. But I couldn't have drafted them as like one big weave with a thread count of 600 or whatever. It would have blown my mind. So that idea that you sort of maybe one structure can be right for getting the thing down, and then you can figure out the structure it can take once you have it there, has been liberating for me in terms of feeling like, okay, I did it how it needed to happen, and now I need to radically sort of pick it up again and reshape it. So it's a great question. Yeah, great, yeah.
So I think it's the introduction to Haunted America by Patricia Nelson Memory, where she talks about, her project as a historian was to take the narrative we have about the settling of the West and look at it and say it was the Cowboys versus the Indians, and say, oh God, that's too simple, and put everybody else that was there, like women, Hispanics, you name it, back into the picture. But then at the end of the essay, she gets to a point and she says, well, as a historian, I'm constantly looking at these things and saying, no, wait, it's not that simple, right? And I think we all have a kind of, particularly people in a room like this, have a distrust for simplicity. And then a couple paragraphs later, she said, but I do have to remind myself that when white people got to Montana, there were people there, and they're not there anymore. And so have you ever, in your process, encountered a moment where you're looking at something and it's really articulated and complicated and difficult, and said,
Yeah. Yes. Okay. First, I'm going to rephrase your beautiful sentiment question or example question. So, the question is about sort of the use of recognizing complexity and recognizing the ways that the stories we've told ourselves might be too simple. But is there ever a point when it also feels important to kind of permit the simpler version of a statement or a story? And yes, absolutely. I mean, there are so many ways I could answer that. One is that even though I'm on the lookout always for cliches in my own writing, I'm actually kind of a huge fan of what cliches can do in speech and between people. And part of that is because I actually do believe sometimes in just saying crude things that feel true, and the fact that there are reasons that cliches become cliches, which is to say they speak to things that often we have lived, and that there can be something powerful that happens in the recognition of the way that a general or universal truth sort of maps onto the particularity and mess of a given life or a given story. The last line of my essay collection is, I want our hearts to be open. I just wrote that. I mean it. I want our hearts to be open. And I feel like that's an example or one way of speaking to exactly what you're talking about, which is to say there's been a lot of thinking that happens in the book before that point. And, obviously I don't think it's an uncomplicated thing to wake up in the morning and have your heart be open. What does that mean? Who is it open to? Is it open to everyone? Is it open to every stranger you ever meet? Is it open to every book that's ever been written? Like, we have a certain finitude of self and time and attention, but I also think there's something really powerful about putting a pretty simple ethical provocation down on the page.
It would seem to be really important in, for example, recovery.
To a certain kind of simplicity. Yeah, and you should buy my book when it comes out. But there's I do think that recovery is part of what is fascinating to me about recovery, and honestly really beautiful about recovery communities, is the way that storytelling is serving a different kind of purpose than it served in most of the communities that I've been a part of, where originality is God, complexity is God. These are like what we bow down to, and I believe in trying to say a thing in a new and beautiful way that it's never been said before. I believe, as I said, in complexity. But I also found it incredibly powerful to witness communities where telling a story that was simple in certain ways, but also deeply felt in a way that was sincere, did a lot of good in people's lives. So the book is an attempt to both analyze how that process works and everything that's at play in that process, but also really honor what it does. So, yeah. Maybe one more. Yeah, in the blue. Oh. It's a hard and great question. The question is about, with a shared personal experience, do you want to write about the experience, but the other person who was part of the experience has rejected including a aspect of that experience that feels vital to your telling of it? What do you do, or how do you handle it? For me, it's been a really case-by-case question. So there have been pieces where I've actually pulled the first piece I was going to publish in the New York Times was an example of a piece where the other person it was about sort of, I don't know if he flatly rejected it. He didn't have the power to change whether it got published or not, but he made clear that he would be deeply upset, offended, stronger language was used, if the piece came out into the world. And in that moment, for all sorts of reasons, it felt like not necessarily there was a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do, but that I wasn't going to like how it felt to wake up in the morning and have the piece out in the world, so I pulled it. There have been other cases where, there's another case where, the other person in question
it kind of bothered them, and we had a lot of long conversations about it, and it became clear to me that, I both altered some things, tried to kind of get at certain complexities from other angles that would allow me to leave certain events out. But I also realized that I wasn't going to get what I wanted from this person, which for them to say, it's absolutely okay, there's no part of me that's bothered by this, I feel 100% at peace with it. Like, that was what I wanted, like total absolution. And I wasn't going to get that. But I also realized it wasn't going to ruin our relationship. It was just going to be something where they wished it hadn't gone out into the world at all. And maybe I wished it had gone out into the world with every little piece that I had imagined intact, or imagined putting into it intact. So that it was kind of like moving forward in a way that was neither on his end of the continuum or mine, but was somewhere in between. And the last thing I'll say in a more general sense is that I think that sometimes people think about this question of writing about other people's lives when it's people you've lived your life with rather than subjects as kind of some kind of either or, black and white. It's like, do you just have the right as the writer to write about whatever you want? Some people believe that. Is it always wrong to write about an experience somebody lived if they haven't given you permission? Like, there are these poles, but to me, I often think it also comes down to just like, what kind of work are you willing to do? Because after a piece has been drafted, there are so many ways to go about handling that time between it getting drafted and it coming out in the world. Like, you can put the time and the work into having a series of difficult conversations with people, and those conversations won't always get you to sort of getting the kind of approval you want, but they can make a big difference, I think, sort of approaching people in an honest spirit of like, can we talk about this? And I'll also say it doesn't always work this way, but there have been many instances in my life where the piece has gotten much, much stronger because memory, as we all know, is really fallible. And I've had a lot of conversations where my version of the truth was really complicated by the other person's memory in ways that were great, in ways that did exactly the work that the first question was also about how do you kind of measure the success of a piece? Well, if I'm trying to get at complexity, I can do some of that interrogation, but it's actually really useful and often offering me something that my own interrogative capacities can't manage to hear somebody else's very different memory of something. So there are ways in which that negotiation process isn't just about, or hasn't just played out as a compromise of the aesthetics of the work for me, but has really deepened and complicated pieces in ways that have made it feel much richer and much more nuanced. So, yeah, thank you so much.